Even people who dislike Donald Trump tend to give him credit for one thing: getting NATO to pay its fair share. American presidents have long grumbled about burden sharing. Trump has been crude, theatrical, and transactional, but the sentiment he expressed was broadly shared, and Europeans got the message. Non-American NATO countries spent 1.4% of GDP on defense in 2014. In 2025, it was close to 2.3%. But be careful what you wish for. The usual assumption is that if Europe spends more, America will spend less. This is demonstrably wrong. European defense spending is at its highest level in decades. Yet Donald Trump has proposed a staggering $1.5 trillion defense budget for fiscal 2027. American defense spending has never been determined by the needs of NATO. It reflects America's role as a global superpower with bases, fleets, and commitments across the world. Washington wants to deter Russia, counter China, project power in the Middle East, protect global sea lanes, defend the homeland, maintain nuclear superiority, dominate space, lead in drones and artificial intelligence, and preserve the ability to fight far from home. In fact, the International Institute for Strategic Studies calculated in 2018 that direct spending on defense in Europe made up only about 5% of America's total defense spending. As Europe's spending increases, the continent will become less dependent on America and therefore less deferential to it. For more than 75 years, America's dominance within NATO has given Washington enormous advantages. The U.S. has over 30 military bases across Europe, and these have allowed it to project power not just in Europe, but in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. U.S. operations in the Middle East, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and more recently with Iran, have depended heavily on access, basing, and overflight rights in Europe. Often, NATO countries have allowed the U.S. to use its facilities even when they disagreed with the war being waged. But as Europeans see that America is unreliable or even hostile, they will feel less need to accommodate Washington. The U.S. has assumed that its allies will always line up behind its broader strategy, including its economic campaigns. But as Celeste Wallander writes in Foreign Affairs, Europe already has its own interests and tools. It holds much of Russia's frozen assets. It has its own sanctions on Russian shipping, finance, and technology. It is home to SWIFT, the payment system whose exclusion of major Russian banks has been so important. If Washington wants to relax pressure on Moscow in a bargain with Vladimir Putin, Europe may refuse. If Washington wants to intensify pressure on Iran or China, Europe may hesitate. Then there's the issue of weapons. One of the hidden benefits of American leadership in NATO has been that Europeans buy American arms. They have bought F-35s, HIMARS, Patriots, P-8 aircraft, and many other systems, not simply because they're good, but because they bind Europe to the United States. Common equipment makes joint operations easier. It also reassures frontline states that American troops will remain engaged. But European officials now speak openly of the need to reduce dependence on American hardware. They fear that the Trump administration could in the future withhold software upgrades, spare parts, or operational support. When Denmark has to worry about an American president threatening Greenland, it will think thrice before buying its next generation of weapons from the United States. For American defense companies, this could be a major loss. For American strategy, it could be larger still. Weapon sales are not just commercial transactions. They create habits of cooperation and shared strategy. There is a final danger. We speak easily of Europe spending more, but defense budgets are still national, and most European governments are broke. As Liana Fix notes in Foreign Affairs, the country with the greatest capacity to spend is Germany, and it is now beginning to do so on a remarkable scale. This is necessary. Germany has been too passive for too long. It is a liberal democracy deeply embedded in Europe, and there is no reason to fear some aggressive impulse in its political DNA. but size and power matter in international politics. A Germany that spends vastly more than its neighbors will inevitably create anxiety in France, Poland, and the smaller countries around it. The genius of America's post-1945 strategy was that it solved this problem. It made it unnecessary for European countries to think and act like traditional great powers. Under the American umbrella, France and Germany did not have to balance each other. The US damped down the intra-European rivalries that had produced centuries of catastrophic war. It created a system that was stable, peaceful, and pro-American. We have set off a chain reaction, and over time, Americans will come to miss the old NATO, not because it was fair, but because it was the most successful security system the world has ever known, with America at its center. For more on the NATO summit and the view from Europe, I am joined by Jeppe Kofod, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, and Frans Timmermans, the former Vice President of the European Commission. Jeppe, when you look at the main security issue Europe now faces, it's Russia's assault on Ukraine, potentially Russia doing something in Europe. Do you think right now most European statesmen are confident that were Russia to attack a NATO country, which it has come close to doing in various ways, that Article 5 would be triggered and the US would come to, say, the defense of Estonia or Lithuania?
No, I think the reality is in Europe, unfortunately, that the trust in Article 5, the 100% trust that used to be there only a few years back, is not there anymore. Of course, on paper, as I said in the declaration, is reiterated Article 5, and an attack on NATO is an attack on all, and we have a collective defense. But you have heard the president, on several occasions questioning whether US will come to Europe to help if there is actually an attack. So Europe is working very, very hard to scale up its own defense investment, be prepared, and even sooner than later be able to defend itself without the support of the United States. Not because Europe wants it, but because it's necessary under these circumstances.
Frans, is there a thought that we just waited out the Trump, it's 2 more years of Trump, and then things go back to normal? Or is there now a long-term plan that will be put in place kind of no matter what? In other words, Europe is going to buy insurance for itself from America, regardless of who is the next president.
Yes, I think it's permanent. I think Europe will have to take care of its own security on a permanent basis. I think if we do that, and if we do right, and if you look at the trends surrounding Ukraine. Ukraine is going to be a security provider for Europe. It's asking for a lot of support now. Europe is coming together to give Ukraine that support, but it will be a phenomenal military power in the future. And the border between us and Russia will be the defining border for Europe's future. And we Europeans will have to take care of that ourselves. And we can. The only thing is we need some time to get there. And at the same time, I'm deeply convinced that if we do this right, America, for its own self-interest, will come back to us. And we will see a NATO in a different nature, but still with an American involvement in the future.
Jeppe, what does this feel like emotionally and culturally in Europe? It's, this is the longest alliance that I can think of in years. It is not simply a political and military alliance. It's an alliance that has created a kind of coherent West, intellectually, culturally, politically, militarily. And it does seem as though there are now serious fissures. The West no longer really exists as we used to always speak about what should the West do? How should the West react? Does it make sense, do you think, in the future, will it make sense to talk about the West when there is such a divide between Europe and the US?
Well, we used to also, when I was foreign minister, to talk about the strongest military alliance in history, NATO, resting on strong common values and interest. And one can, easily argue today the values part is pretty gone because there are a different perception of what values we should pursue. And the interest part, you can say on the United States first, for example, America first will change, as changing that and the perception of what that means for U.S. with President Trump is not a strong Europe. It's apparently a weak Europe. So the whole fundament behind NATO is falling apart in a sense. So that's why Europe needs to put its act together, not talk about Trump or US, but talk about itself and rearm and build up a strong deterrence to the east with Russia, because even if there's a ceasefire and hopefully peace with Ukraine, Russia will still be a threat. And the same with United States, even if there's a new president after Trump ends his presidency, the structural changes of Europe need to be able to defend itself alone, and US not being a 100% reliable ally in all instances is there for the future.
Thank you, gentlemen. Fascinating conversation. Really appreciate it.